Okay, good afternoon. Come on right in, sit in the front three rows if you would. We have a nice small audience, and I'll give you the compliments after I do a little bit of introduction. My name is Bill Moore, and I'm president of Moore & Associates, a paper recycling consultancy based out of Atlanta. And to my right, Susan Cornish, principal consultant with Insight and Action, which is a packaging sustainability practice. And on my far right is Dan G., senior associate of Moore & Associates. He works together with me, and he's based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. So I know we've got a serious audience because we're competing with the best day weather-wise in a couple weeks here. So the people who shun the beach and sun for this session are seriously interested in EPR. So we'll move right along. We'll take some questions. If you have a question during the presentation, just raise your hand so we can take that question. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A time frame also. So here's a legal disclaimer. EPR has got a lot of regulatory framework. I'm not going to go through all this. You can read it. You can get a copy of it. We did this presentation in conjunction with some information from the Circular Action Alliance, who's the leading producer responsibility organization in the U.S. We're not giving any legal advice, the usual disclaimers on the presentation. And EPR is complicated and evolving, so things are changing all the time. So we're going to introduce EPR, go through what it's all about, create some awareness. There are no states in the Southeast that have EPR right now, but Tennessee has just proposed, so it's getting closer and it's going to spread. We'll go over the other states that have it, but it is spreading and it will continue to spread, I think. The EPA just last year started to study a national EPR bill. It will be interesting to see what happens under the Trump administration. You might know that a program that was getting off the ground, environmental justice at EPA, has been virtually shut down, and I haven't heard anything about EPR yet. I don't think EPR is as controversial as environmental justice is. And some of the deadlines actually start this year in some of the states. And it has major implications to the recycling industry. And we'll talk about fiber recovery rates because EPR legislation, the goal is to increase packaging recovery and also to design packages that are more recyclable. And a big piece of it, and Dan's going to handle that in the presentation, is what's called responsible end markets. People who bale and pack materials in EPR states are only allowed to sell the material to certified responsible end markets. And you'll learn a lot more about that in the middle of the presentation. I'm going to start out, then Susan's going to take over a bit, and Dan will do the REM section, and I'll come in at the end and close it out. So, why EPR and why now? The interest has grown for several reasons. You can see the bullets up there. There's a growing concern about the environment among consumers and the different stakeholders. And there's a new type of packaging has grown quite a bit in the last time frames, and especially things like flexible plastics, multi-layered, more complex materials, and the difficult to recycle materials have been growing. The consumer packaged goods companies have announced goals to reduce the use of virgin plastic and make packaging more recyclable and reusable. Their initial goals were in 2018, 2019. Progress has been slow. A major factor was when China stopped importing recyclables from the U.S., it threw the market into a tizzy. Low-end plastics and low-end fiber grades, the market's the bottom dropped out for almost 2 years. And what happened at that time frame was the revenues that used to support the programs didn't support them anymore, and the service providers changed their model from taking large amounts of the commodity risk, and they pushed that on to the cities. and they raised the processing costs. Processing costs for MRFs between 2017 and 2022 have almost tripled across the country. And that led the cities to saying, wait a second, we don't want to fund it to this level. So the funding is being pushed on to the packaging and companies and brands that put the packaging into commerce, and taxes on the different packaging will go to fund recycling programs. So it's a totally different scheme, and we'll get into that in some more detail. And it is seen as this alternative funding approach. But one of the other things is the taxing system is supposed to be favorable to packages that are more easily recyclable. A corrugated box, for example, might have a low tax because it's easy to recycle, or a newspaper, whereas a three-layer flexible plastic pack is going to have a much higher tax on it because it's much more difficult to present. So, Susan, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Great, thank you, Bill. And we will take you through some of the details. There is a lot of detail related to EPR. Now, one thing about EPR that is not always evident is it really is not new. It started in the 90s as municipalities wanted to control what went into landfill. And so tires, engine oil, and then I've got the list there, batteries, carpet, mattresses, electronics. A large number of things have been added to the list of things we don't want to send to landfill. And so there are programs of different types, EPR programs to direct those materials. And here's a map. You'll see the West Coast. The dark blue is where there are the largest number of existing EPR programs, and the gray states are where there are no EPR programs. So the Northeast, a little bit in the Midwest, and the West Coast. This map looks a lot like the actual packaging EPR programs. So, as Bill has already said, in the simplest explanation you see in that great chart from the Product Stewardship Institute on the right, the idea is to get producers to make better packages, things that are more environmentally friendly, that are recyclable, in some cases compostable, and also reusable. And if they did that in the design phase, that blue section, then when the package ends up at the consumer, it would be a lot easier for the consumer in the green section, the consumer being orange. As a consumer has to dispose of it, it would be more evident what needs to happen to it. So the producers to consumers is all of EPR. And so packaging and recycling. Lots of benefits. Big increases in residential recycling will be expected. Those are going to be targets that are set by programs. Greater access to recycling and increased participation should result with more education going to consumers. More recycled content in packaging, if that starts from the producers, would alleviate some of the shortages that producers who now have goals to reduce virgin plastic. It will put more recycled materials into the system. It should provide more stable funding for residential recycling programs, and all the innovation related to new types of packaging will lead to changes in product design, new materials, and new manufacturing processes. So much, certainly the last couple of bullet points there are very much in process. Downsides might be that we have a lot of market disruption, and I think producers are starting to experience that now. There are a lot of requirements for recycled content, new labeling, improved recyclability, etc. What about shifting the end-of-life cost to consumers? Aren't producers just going to then bill consumers for the costs that are being shifted to producers? We heard from a good source. Now, we don't really know because none of these programs are actually operating yet, but we did hear from a good source that the expectation would be that consumers would no longer have to pay for recycling programs, that would be covered by the program. So that would mean consumers would save at that end. Now, the waste and recycling industries want to ensure that there isn't duplication. Some of the Canadian provinces have taken over what used to be a private market recycling function or material sales functions. And what if EPR decisions were carved in stone that could study? So there are lots of pros and cons. And so generally how it works is the PRO, the Producer Responsibility Organization, is the entity that's responsible for setting up the program, running the program, and in accordance with state legislation. The PRO is a nonprofit, and most states allow multiple PROs. Fees are going to be developed by the PRO in each state. The PRO will distribute the funds to cover improving programs, education for consumers. And on the right side, producers' responsibilities, they are required to join the PRO in a state that has EPR legislation. Producers are going to be required to report the volume of covered materials that they send. The legislation is in place. And they're required to pay fees based on the volume of the material in the state. Eco-modulation is a process that will monitor over time changes in the fees. And we'll take a look a little later at some of how that is going to work. So there's a map of the states that have already passed EPR legislation, the green states: Oregon, California, Colorado, Minnesota, and Maine. And states where there's legislation in place are the gray-colored states. You can see that Illinois and Maryland have started some groundwork legislation, even though an EPR program hasn't been fully passed. New Jersey, New York, Washington State, there's been a lot of work, and we think those are the states that are likely to go next. Tennessee has started some things, Massachusetts also. So if all the state, and then there's some other states at the bottom there. Let's see if this works. Always trouble with Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Hawaii. So a lot of states have started taking some steps. So in total, about 17 states have started to deal with legislation. Now there is one PRO that has emerged, and that is the Circular Action Alliance. It was started by these 20 companies. There are now hundreds of members of the PRO. So in effect, CAA is a nonprofit started by these 20 companies. All of these companies obviously make a lot of packaging, food, beverage, consumer goods, and retailers. And let's move on to the CAA's mission is to comply with EPR laws in states. They're working on harmonizing differences across the states. You'll see that there are many significant differences across the legal structures that the different states have put in place. They're looking to leverage existing recycling systems and infrastructure. So that's an explicit part of their goals. And they're looking to collaborate with local governments, service providers, and recycling system processors. So they really want to kind of work with everybody who's involved. But there are some big differences. Now, we said 17 states are involved, and we're just going to go and look at the box at the bottom of the page here. In the past, Bill was involved in environmental laws going back several decades. And when you get to the point like hazardous waste, where half the states have laws, and the laws are different in every state, it becomes difficult for a national manufacturer to actually deal with all those states. It's at that point that the federal government typically will get involved. We know that the EPA has started to look at EPR, and if we're at 17 states doing something, give it 5 or 6 more states, and there's likely to be some action. But it has been a very lengthy process, and I've got some timelines in here for states to actually move this legislation forward because it is so complex. And with 4 years in the current administration, our getting national quite that quickly. So we're going to go through a bunch of detailed slides here to try to understand the key elements. So we've talked about the PRO, which is going to run the programs. The first question that came to my mind was, so what's covered anyway? So think packaging, and each state has a list of covered materials. And generally speaking, the covered materials are packaging that is received, that the consumer takes home from the point of sale and the household. So that's the concern about end of life. Where does the packaging go after the consumer gets it? It typically excludes materials that are used in the manufacturing process, production processes, anything where it can be off-spec materials sold through business-to-business contracts. Generally, those are excluded and not considered covered. Packaging is, some states include printed paper products like flyers. Some get into a lot of detail about food serviceware, and some include single-use plastic bags. What is excluded is anything that would be covered by a bottle bill, so any returnable container that has its own program is going to be excluded in the states that have return deposit programs. Books are generally excluded. Nobody wants to use paper towels. Whole tissue categories excluded. Nursery products, like baby products, are excluded. Pharmaceuticals and medical products, packaging and products, containers for long-term storage, and anything hazardous or toxic is generally not in these programs. And there generally are targets lots of time. So if we look at covered materials across the states, we don't need to go into the detail for each state. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, then what you can see is there are a lot of differences. In Maine, it's real simple, packaging used for containing stuff. In Oregon and California, there's a bit more of a focus on food serviceware, especially single-use plastics. Auto printing and writing papers included, and flyers and magazines, but not newspapers. It's a pretty straightforward explanation. Now, the product manufacturer is called the producer, so EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility. And there's a lot of discussion and a very lengthy, wordy discussion about who the producer is in each of these states. But generally speaking, the producer is the manufacturer responsible for making the package, but it's the brand owner. And so, for example, with the example of USPS, they sell packages, and you buy them to ship things, but they have the brand. When you buy it, it says USPS. They don't make that box. They buy them from a number of different sources. They would be, in that case, the producer, because they put the brand on it. But you buy any kind of food or grocery product, the producer is Nestle, Unilever, whoever has the brand on the product. Whether they made the package or not doesn't matter, it's the brand owner. So in states where there is no manufacturer for that product, like say Maine, not too many manufacturers are based in Maine, it's the importer or the distributor. Or even on the right, if the consumer goes into a retail shop and gets additional packaging is added, you walk out with some bags, The retailer is the producer for the packaging that is given to the consumer at retail. And e-commerce is really the same. Amazon is responsible for the Amazon box that they put all those different brands in. But the brands themselves are responsible for the boxes that the products are in. So it can get very convoluted. And producer definitions, there are a lot of differences, but let's just go straight to who's exempt. So the first question that manufacturers are going to be asking is, can I be exempted from this? So you can see that small businesses generally are exempted, but the amount of the small business varies from 1 million to 5 million. State and local governments are exempted. Federal in Minnesota, state and local in Colorado, public bodies in Oregon. The language is vague. Sometimes governments is accepted. Nonprofits are usually exempted. And small producers of agricultural products. So roadside stands might be exempted. And generally across the 5 states that are in operation now, California and Oregon exclude food service. Maine's program is a little bit different in that they have an SO, not a PRO. And in Maine, it's basically the State Department of Environmental Protection is the PRO, or the SO. They're making all the decisions. In California and Oregon, the state is very involved in making the rules and making the decisions. In Colorado and Minnesota, the PRO is really making the decisions. So there are some real differences in the role of the state and in the funding structures across the states. And this slide summarizes some of those differences. And there are differences in funding. Can we go into that a bit later? Okay. Timelines. You can see generally the first thing they do is make the list of what are the materials that are going to be covered. Secondly, the publishes the list, and we're still in the early stages of doing that for most of these states. You can see that payments to producers, no, we can't get our cursor. Payments to producers start as early as 2026, and plans begin, like Maine begins even later. Minnesota is still in very early stages of working out the details. In all of these states, there are needs assessment. Maryland was one of the first to do the needs assessment. The needs assessment is being done fairly early in Minnesota, later in Illinois, and Maine, even though they started the process first, is at the tail end on needs assessment. So what are some of the targets that these programs are going to be focused on? One of them is source reduction. Source reduction is, and this is one of the more important ones, basically means minimizing waste from the beginning of the product's life cycle, so designing the product and the packaging so that it minimizes packaging and encourages practices like recycling and or composting, generally producing less waste. And what are the source reduction targets as far as we know them? So far, Maine is going to do that during rulemaking. In Oregon, the PRO is responsible for identifying where exactly what materials are going to be the focus of source reduction. Colorado is going to develop incentives. California has some specific goals, and they're looking to reduce plastic in all of those different groups of materials that are covered by 10%, then 20%, then 25%. So they've got some specific goals. Minnesota is still working on those targets. Here are some of the new states. Performance targets that New York and New Jersey have set are pretty specific. Reduce single-use packaging by 25% by 2032. So they've got 7 years. But a pretty substantial number if you think of all the single-use packaging that you would run into a supermarket. Similar numbers from New York. Recycling rates need to be much higher than they are now, given that the recycling target rate in Washington State is 50%, was set at 50% in 1989. New Jersey is looking to get the recycling rate to 65% within 10 years when it is half of that now. So we've got some pretty, and there are labeling requirements in a number of states, but not all of the states. So these are the kind of targets that states are setting, and it's a real mixed bag across different states. Now, to look at fees and eco-modulation, which is how fees are going to will change over time. First of all, we know producers are going to have to report on the volume of materials that they sell in the states that have the legislation. So anybody who is a national producer, brand owner, is going to have a lot of data to report. The PRO is working on harmonizing the fee structure across all the materials that might be in any EPR program. So there are different materials in all the programs, different categories. Fortunately, CAA is the only PRO that's emerged so far, and so they're able to think across all the states that are active and, kind of do a master list and do similar fee structures for, say, small businesses versus large for different types of companies. So they're working on building more consistency into it than what states. Yes?
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yep.
The fees you might be covering this. Are they paid to the PRO and then the PRO?
Yes, the PRO does everything. They're involved in areas, as we said, but the PRO will set the fees, and they set up an agreement with the state. There's a complicated agreement with each brand owner. Did I repeat the question? So the fees are supply driven. They're based on the volume of packaging in each given state. And CAA has stated that fees will change. The idea is that they will go down over time, so that over time, companies will make the package more recyclable, more easily composted, or even reusable. And that is built into the fees. So over time, producers should become better environmental citizens and produce better packaging or more environmentally sound packaging. CAA has said that the initial reporting, how reporting is as it starts, it's a bit vague. Over time, it'll become more precise, and there could be radical changes in the amount of the fees. So the fees go to the PRO and are used to improve recycling, composting, source reduction, all the various targets, which are going to make packaging more environmentally friendly. Okay, so eco-modulation. So I've got a couple of charts. This, one thing I was going to mention at the beginning, everything we show you in this presentation may change tomorrow. There is a lot of discussion, a lot of negotiation, and there are a number of states haven't met deadlines to do all the steps in the process. This is a very simplified version of something that came, Oregon is the first state to actually start putting prices on materials. And and there's a much longer list, like 60 different materials, that's a short list of them. There's a low rate and a high rate. The low rate is for things that are easily recycled, since if you look at recycling, composting, and reusable packaging, recycling is the thing that's done the most, or is maybe the easiest. So the low rate means it's easy, the high rate means it's difficult, and there's a base fee and then a bunch of other fees that may be added, which add up to a total fee. So you'll see that the amount per pound for newspapers, and that's probably printing and writing paper, that's the terminology they used, 1 cent per pound is pretty cheap, and the cost per ton, $20, is certainly reasonable, and there is no difference between low and high because it's very recyclable. But when you get down to aluminum containers, 6 cents per pound, and the high rate is higher. Steel aerosol containers and pressurized cylinders, much more expensive. So the fees are going to be a lot more for things that can't be recycled or are very difficult to recycle. And this is purely an example for illustration. That was just a short. It didn't come out of the example, the only example that I had to use. It wasn't on there. Plastics will be on the list, and that was a very short list. There were 65 different items on the sort of draft fee schedule that came out of Oregon. And okay, this is my last slide, eco-modulation. So each of the states has different targets, as we looked at some of those slides. And the states are setting up incentives. What are the targets that the brand owner needs to reach in order to get their fees reduced? So across the 5 states, you can see that all the states agree that more recycled content will reduce your fee. And there are differences across all the states on the others. The only 2 things that Oregon has stated, the other thing is reach a high recycling rate. Maine, the first 5 or 6 things, several states want to decrease toxic elements. That is part of California, part of Minnesota. Compostable is a factor in California and Maine. Improve the labeling is a factor in a couple states. So you can see it's a real mixed bag as far as what brand owners are going to be seeking to target across each state with legislation. So if you're a national manufacturer, you're going to be doing all of these things because you can't produce different stuff for California versus Oregon versus Maine very effectively. And that is my last slide. Do we want to hand it over to Dan? And Dan will talk about end markets, which affects everybody in recycling, in the recycling business.
Thank you, Susan. So I want to refer back to the timeline. A lot of what I will talk about references the state of Oregon. That is because they're the first state that's actually going to put it into law in less than 6 months, July 1st of this year. So Oregon's kind of the trendsetter. California is January 1st, 2027. Colorado doesn't have a lot of impact, but lots of the decisions being made in Oregon are being watched by the other states. So they're kind of the model, and the other states are learning from them. So just wanted you to kind of know why we speak about Oregon. Okay. Okay, responsible end markets, also abbreviated by the term REM. So basically, EPR legislation's intent is to ensure that all the recyclables being produced in these programs that are covered in the program are being sold to well-managed businesses. So what makes a responsible end market? Basically, we're focused on recovered paper, but this does include other commodities, as Susan referenced in some of her previous slides. So recovered paper end markets are going to include domestic U.S. mills. They're going to include specialty product mills that use paper fiber as a raw material, like ceiling tile or insulation, things like that. They also include export mills. And EPR laws do require Circular Action Alliance, the PRO, to verify that these end markets are following these these basic 4 areas. First, they want to make sure they're following laws and regulations. Second, they want to be sure that they have confidence that there's a consistent, reliable system on chain of custody from the point of shipping to the mill. Third, they want to make sure that the yield at the mill is meeting minimum standards. And then fourth, purely they want to be environmentally responsible so that they're not recycling more, but somehow harming the environment in the process. So we'll go through each one of these individually in a little more detail. So compliance to laws and regulations. Let's break down each of these categories. Legal compliance, basically what laws and regulations and policies are we talking about? We're talking about the country that it's being shipped to. So in the US, it's going to be federal law, it's going to be state law, it's going to be the local regulations and policies. You go outside the US, then it switches to shipping to Mexico or shipping to Thailand, shipping to any country, Southeast Asia, Europe, etc. There's a function of making sure that people are being treated fairly and there's no free labor, harassment, discrimination, that they're doing a good job showing awareness that the environmental, they basically have an environmental system and that it's a priority to that mill. There's a long list here: bribery, corruption, basic things that we kind of take for granted, that most mills are going to be running their business in a professional manner. Materials management, that's basically what comes into their mill, what ships out of their mill, and then what's created as a residual, as a waste product. Also, they want that mill to be transparent in sharing any kind of violations. And that's expected. In running a business, you're going to run into problems. But as long as they're upfront about it and resolve the problem, that will take care of it. And then at the bottom, environmental compliance, just basically following environmental laws and regulations, having the proper permits, having inspections as needed, and not causing any obvious contamination to the environment. Transparency is definitely a consistent theme for responsible end markets. When it comes to chain of custody verification in domestic shipments in the US, it's basically following that bill of lading from the shipper to where it ships to the end user mill. Pretty simple. For export, the diagram here showing the supply base on the far left, it's being shipped on an ocean carrier. It may go to a product, or it may go into a warehouse, then ultimately goes to the end use mill or to the mill. Transparency also includes that the REM mills are agreeable to sharing their records and being open to audits, and that they share information on how they dispose of their material. That becomes a residual in their manufacturing process. And I've covered reporting violations and penalties. Yield requirements. So again, this is based on the state of Oregon setting a minimum yield of 60%, and the definition which the state of Oregon has provided is that the yield loss only includes short fiber loss and does not include non-fiber contaminants or moisture, which is interesting, kind of counterintuitive. And that yield definition may vary state to state. So we're starting with Oregon. But as a practical matter, recycling paper fiber, no mill's going to stay in business if they are losing 40% of their material that they buy to make a new product and have to do something with that much of wasted material. So as a practical matter, recycled fiber-based mills can easily meet the 60% minimum requirement. Circular Action Alliance, the note at the bottom, has the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality requesting that paper mills should not have to provide that data because it's sensitive. Mills do not like to share. They feel like that's something they shouldn't have to share. So CAA is waiting for that. They feel, but they're waiting for it to be approved in writing, and they're hopeful of that. So the question here really is, does the mill have a good system for environmental process? And do they have a person that's designated to manage that? Those are kind of the first two questions. And going further into that, do they have an environmental management system? There's some ISO 14001 programs that are specific to environmental management systems. On environmental measurement and being able to measure that, as well as very aware of the chemicals used at their mill and how they manage that, how they disclose it, and how they prevent leaks and storage, any kind of pollution involving chemicals. That would definitely be a sensitive area. So Circular Action's vision and principles towards the whole responsible end market verification really comes down to three things. They really want to collaborate with the mills and and try to harmonize the various requirements between state to state to state. And we're starting kind of from scratch here with Oregon being first, as I mentioned, then it's going to go into other states. They each are slightly different, but Circular Action Alliance knows the success of this is going to be how can we kind of bring this all together so suppliers don't have to be an expert in multiple states and they have more of a consistent rule to follow. Data sensitivity, Circular Action Alliance asking for data, but they value confidentiality is a very key element to make it work, and I will explain more on a future slide here on how they plan to do that. And then they wanted to leverage existing certifications. There are multiple certifications that paper mills already have in place that will take care of chain of custody, other requirements within the REM requirements. They don't expect the mills to reinvent the wheel. They are going to, they know and they want to use those to make verification for the different requirements. And they're aware of that. So Circular Action Alliance's three-step process is basically, has created a self-attestation form, and I'll show you that in a future slide here, designed for end markets. And basically, after the paper mill or mill goes through that 3-page form and provides the documentation that goes along with that and signs that form, they are considered REM compliant, and they're pre-approved by Circular Action Alliance. So this is a kind of a trust commitment based on the information provided. After that, then Circular Action Alliance is going to begin reviewing the data that they're asking for with the mill to ensure that the information that they received is actually happening. And then lastly, they are going to do audits. Audits are not done by Circular Action Alliance. They'll actually hire third-party auditors, and the information, the specific information from these auditors is going to be aggravated, that's the wrong word. Thank you. So that it's basically protected. And that is both in domestic mills and export mills. So this is definitely a big job. We consolidated the self-attestation form, but here's an example of this is the exact form today. We took a little bit of information off of it to make it simple to understand. Basically, on the left side, that is pertaining to the facility, the mill that is providing the information, and also this self-attestation form does have some implications for the recycler and the processor and broker into these mills. So it's mills, brokers, processors, and MRFs that will use this form. The mills have the most detailed information that need to be provided. The MRFs, the suppliers, basically only have to provide what type of material they're shipping and then help with the chain of custody information. And that's done through the third-party auditor. The right-hand side of here is just showing what kind of products that are being handled by either the mill or the supplier. And you'll see this is a combination of paper, of aluminum, of some plastics grades, some glass, pressurized cylinders, etc. Page 2 of this is basically covering a request for any kind of business permit or operating permit that this mill has, or the supplier, the basic business permit. If you have an environmental permit, they're asking for that on the front end, and any kind of certificates that are pertaining to environmental compliance. There's also a complete description of the REM standards and requirements that are part of this form that I left off just because it would be duplication. Again, this is Oregon's model of what are the REM impacts to the actual supplier being a MRF or a paper processing plant. Again, emphasizing this is starting in less than 6 months. a quick review of what are the covered materials that Susan talked about earlier, listed there. Again, it's both pertaining to domestic and export mills. And the REM mills are, we're just kind of backtracking here. Chain of custody documentation, bill of ladings, or export documentations would be what they'd be required to provide to the auditor after they sign the forms for self-attestation. Non-compliance, I didn't spend a lot of time here, but CAA has 5 different levels of non-compliance, from totally compliant to a little minor non-compliant to non-compliant that's fixable, non-compliant that's a little worse, and then so bad that we are not going to allow you to ship. But the whole idea of anything that's non-compliant is in the hope that it can be corrected and that commerce can continue. And the bottom bullet, Oregon 869-13, there is an exemption that states for like commercial packers that are dealing in nothing but clean OCC. They'll be included on the verification of shipments, but there's probably going to be an exemption in the fee structure as long as they can prove that that material is going to a REM mill. So I think that's an important question that people are having on how's that really going to work. Looking at brokers that are shipping recycled fiber, again, Oregon starting, there's not that much. Most of what Oregon brokers ship are to domestic mills, probably 90%, but there's probably a 10% of the material does go export. So these requirements are very similar to the same requirements I just mentioned for MRFs and processors. So there's lots of duplication here. But basically brokers, about the 6th bullet down there, they must maintain a chain of custody of transaction records, basically their shipment records for 5 years, and make that available to PRO or chain of Circular Action Alliance upon their request. The leverage for non-compliance, if someone just refuses to agree, that could impact the broker or the MRF or the processor ability to renew their business license. The state would eventually catch up with them. Again, that same exemption holds true for clean OCC I mentioned previously. So here's a little more on confidentiality. When after a mill or a MRF or a processor has signed the form of self-attestation, what happens with the auditor? Circular Action Alliance is not doing the auditing. They don't want to know the specifics. They want it to be protected, the information be protected, and the third-party auditor is going to take all the information, group it with all the MRFs they're auditing, put all that information together, and that goes to the state of Oregon and to Circular Action Alliance. So it's putting it all together in aggregate, I got it that time, rather than individual. And there are third-party auditing firms established in the US. They're also in Thailand, in Vietnam. They know the customs, they know the language. They've probably been to that mill before looking on environmental compliance. So That's the plan for third-party auditing. And CAA will not ever be given access to the detailed information. So what is CAA looking for as far as input? They are talking to many mills, MRFs, processors, and brokers in the industry right now, and will continue this year as they prepare for Oregon and each state, state by state. And they're asking specifically, is the REM criteria achievable? And they want to know if it's not achievable, why not? What do we have to do to make changes to make it more realistic? And they want to take the written legislation and the real world and try to put them together to make it workable. Asking about what challenges they anticipate either any of these entities facing, and how do they feel about the policies being requested? Are they already in place? And what's their attitude towards auditing? Are they willing to share information? And is the information that they're being requested available? So those are real life questions that they know, CAA knows that each of these entities, they need their cooperation and trust, and they're working on that day by day, week by week, as they approach these looming starting points state by state. And here's my support where needed. Circular Action Alliance is flexible. As Susan alluded to, things will be changing. Things have already changed, and they will continue to change. Again, other states will watch as each previous states get implemented to see what works well, what doesn't work well, and how they can adapt to make it better. Same with Circular Action Alliance. They want to figure out what works and what doesn't work well and how to make it better. They want to harmonize these certification schemes listed there, SFI, PEFC, ISO 14000. These are just some examples that the mills have. These are things pertaining to mills that they have in place, certifications that they're required to have to operate their mill already in the U.S. I know ISO 14001, I've seen reference to many of the Southeast Asian mills also use that environmental management system. CAA also wants to support requests for exemptions from verification as long as they can justify it. And they are prioritizing verifications of markets that are higher risk, and export markets are definitely much higher risk than domestic markets, and harder to verify. Also, they will have in their budget to provide third-party assistance to end markets that need help in audit preparation. So this is placing a lot of work on brokers, processors, MRFs, and I don't have specifics on it, but Circular Action Alliance is making that offer. So EPR is complicated, and it's developing state by state. Right now, there's a lot of unknowns. Over time, solutions are going to emerge, this will occur. And the bottom line is CAA needs to listen to the industry, streamline processes, and meet the EPR state requirements. I'll turn it to Bill.
So thanks, Dan. I'm going to try and pieces together here and go back on a more macro approach to what EPR is and what the impacts are. So this, I really like this chart. It looks at, in terms of billions of US dollars, global packaging markets by material. And you can see on the bottom, rigid paper has been growing a little bit in percentages and certainly dollars. When you get up near the top, metals and glass have been fairly static. Flexible plastics have been growing fairly strongly, not only in percentage, but the amount of dollars in the market. And flexible plastics are going to be the most difficult to get into EPR compliance. And then flexible paper has been increasing a bit also. So this was a study, the Recycling Partnership last year. They do some really nice work. And this looked at what gets recycled and what winds up in the trash. And you can see, you know, we're still throwing away a lot of packaging. And the good players are PET bottles, no big surprise. Corrugated does pretty well. Mixed paper is kind of in the middle. A lot of it's recovered, but a lot of it's lost also. And you can see the little black mark, that's lost at the MRF as compared to lost at the household. And, you know, glass and mixed paper have the highest loss at the MRF. So, is to increase recycling rates. And TRP, again, did a study looking around the world, and you can see the numbers for some Canadian provinces and different countries, pre-EPR, and then with EPR, some pretty dramatic increases on the left-hand side chart. The right-hand side chart is a forecast of what the some of the states in the U.S. expect to be able to increase their recycling rates to with EPR. So we'll see how that plays out. Kind of an amazing number. If you believe the numbers, that it's 21% now, and they think they're going to go to 70%, which is an astronomical increase. So here's some targets for EPR in the state of California, and by 2032, the industry must cut the use of single plastics by 25%, packaging and foodware, and then recycle 65% of single-use plastics, packaging and foodware, and ensure 100% use of single-use packaging and plastic foodware is recyclable and compostable. So some pretty tough goals there probably to meet, but there's a fair amount of time on this also. So environmental drivers, and if you look around the world and in the US and Canada, where higher disposal costs, you get more recycling. It's a pure economic pull-through. And if you look at places like Germany and Japan, which have very high disposal costs, they have the highest recycling rates in the world. The U.S. is kind of in the middle of the pack to maybe above average, certainly disposal. But if you go to the third world, where disposal costs are very low, you'll find very low recycling rates. There's just the economics of the pull-through are not there. And the same is true in the U.S. If you look at places like New England, Florida, and California, where disposal costs are above average, you'll find an above average recycling rate. What we're missing on low-hanging fruit is multifamily and small commercial are the most under-recovered sectors, and hopefully EPR will be able to help get those numbers up. Standardizing the approach, you know, that we've got a citizenry that doesn't understand recycling because it's different from place to place, and when they move, they get different rules, different materials, and you know, some standardizing which is being attempted, but it's difficult in the U.S. because we're a pretty heterogeneous country in a lot of respects. And then creating better domestic end markets. That's one of the goals of EPR, is to, if an end market isn't there, can it be created? And then improve the human factors and consumer education. You know, when we started to do a lot of residential recycling in the late 80s and early 90s, we had big education programs. And for about 15 years, those went away. I think we're going to see those coming back, and there's a good need for it. in terms of material preparation and how to run the program and how to put the right stuff in the bin. So what are the issues and problems with EPR? And these are kind of just come from my view of recycling over quite some time. There's big concerns about the pros controlling the program funding, and will they act in a manner that keeps recycling growing and on a level for the different materials? That's a big concern. Variation between the states. If we have all these different laws, are we going to run into the same thing again where the population gets confused because it's different from one state to the next? And some EPR programs in Canada have supplanted existing recycling programs, and that's not a good thing. British Columbia, which went first in North America, effectively created a monopoly in the province for recycling that came under EPR, both marketing materials and processing. And it's not a big surprise that BC has the highest average cost of recycling in North America. So there's some lessons to be learned there. I mean, BC has some unusual things, a lot of rural population, and they get the same service that the rest of the province does. Quebec, which is now moving fairly quickly with their EPR, they've decided that both the commercial and the residential collected recyclables will be marketed by an entity that was set up, quasi-public-private entity. And I worked on the design of the Quebec program. And once they got everything in place and we're getting ready to run, they called me up and said, can you introduce us to 5 recovered paper brokers that we can sell our material to? And I said, hey, wait a second, this stuff's all being sold already. And it was a rude surprise to the paper mills in Quebec that the commercial materials are not going to be handled the way they're being done now. So that's a big concern. Marketing recyclables gets into the hands of a state or a province. I think that's real problematic. And the compliance required by the REM may disrupt the domestic and export markets. You can see Dan's presentation. We're not the first to do this. Europe is slightly ahead of us on EPR, and they're still finding their way, but we've been spending a lot of time with the Asian countries and the paper mills on educating, and they're getting it from both Europe and from the States too. Getting the export mills to comply is going to be a challenge, but we started working on it already, and CAA has funded a lot of work to get those ducks in a row. So, sum it up, and you can see from this presentation and some of the pieces, it's a very complicated piece of new legislation. I've seen this a couple times in the environmental business and recycling business. I call EPR the full consulting employment business. When I harken back to aseptic packages, think of Tetra Pak juice packages. Back in 1991, Maine banned those packages as not being recyclable. And Oregon was about to ban it, and Tetra Pak and Elipak and the other aseptic makers got together, and they hired every recycling consultant in the United States to work on it. And over time, they turned that around. When I first saw EPR about 3 years ago, I said, well, we got to track this. It's going to have some effect. And I never thought we would be doing EPR consulting work, but we're getting EPR consulting work coming from 2 ways. One are the packaging and the brand people who need to understand it better and understand the existing recycling infrastructure out there. And then we're doing all this REM work. We're really the technical advisors for CAA in 3 states on the paper recycling side of things. And then there's people doing plastics. And there are dedicated consulting firms to EPR that have come out. Pierre Benedis and Likens, he's Mr. CAA and EPR consultant. He designed the Quebec program, and he's working in the 3 Western states. So the goals of EPR, don't get me wrong, the goals of EPR are laudable. Stabilizing funding for recycling programs, yes, I mean, that's a laudable goal. However, and I'll cover a few bullets down, that I think recycling over the last couple of years has been on the most stable economic footing in a long time. The second goal, to financially penalize difficult to recycle packaging. It's a great goal. Is it going to be too complicated and too difficult to really factor that in? In Europe, some of the give you an idea on taxes. For example, corrugated in one country has $100 a ton tax, and flexible plastic packaging has $1,000 a ton tax. And you know that could be a real distortion in the marketplace. A lot of incentive to recycle, but those are difficult to handle materials. And the last goal was bolster end markets. And you know, end markets usually take care of themselves. If you've got a lot of a material to recycle and it's difficult to recycle, it probably will get recycled because it's volume and it's a raw material. If you have really clean material, like converting scrap from a bottle plant or a box plant, that's going to get recycled because it's easy and it's clean. The difficult ones are small quantities of material that's either because of its design or contamination that make it difficult. Pot pie bowls with food residue in them, they're very difficult to recycle post-consumer wise. You know, again, flexible packaging with 5 layers that are wonderful performance items. Probably the only outcome is some sort of mixed or chemical recycling, which there's a lot of pushback on. You know, so we'll succeed. You know, when China banned our recyclables, and actually EPR came out of the China ban for recyclables because markets fell apart, price for communities to recycle went way up, and but the market corrected itself before EPR. We got a lot of domestic capacity to process plastics and process paper. And really the economic footing, as I mentioned before, has been very much straightened out, albeit the city's picking up a higher amount of costs, but it's difficult to do residential recycling. You know, will EPR upset the apple cart? I think there's a chance of that. I also think there's a chance that EPR will flounder under its own complexity too, as you can see by all the things we've gone over here. So while EPR is affecting a small number of states, and mentioned earlier, none in the Southeast, although Tennessee is advancing, and I mentioned EPA moving towards a national look at it, it's definitely going to spread on the states, and it will come to the Southeast, and it will spread throughout the U.S. To try and really change the recycling system in a lot of respects. Again, the goals, the high-level goals are completely laudable. It's in the implementation and the potential to upset the recycling collection and processing infrastructure in the U.S. So thanks for your attention, and we'll take some questions from the panel. We're going to sit up here. Use these mics, and then there's a handheld going around for anybody who has specific questions.
You stated processor and MRF. So where does a box plant or a grocery store chain fall in that? Are they a MRF, they're a processor? What are they?
A grocery store chain that's consolidating baled corrugated would be a producer. So if it's let's use Oregon, that's where we're starting. If it's a grocery store in Oregon and they ship it to a mill, whether it's domestic or export, yes, they will need to fill out the self-attestation form. Basically 2 things: provide proof that they have an operating business license, and 2, be open to audits on the types of material they're shipping and the track chain of custody.
Well, to answer your first part of the question, the converting box plants aren't in the system.
Okay. So, but even with a grocery store chain, they didn't make the product. They just distributed the product. So I just wonder, yeah, I mean, is that going to encourage mills to purchase more from the box plants, from other sources other than a MRF? Because
The answer to that is the box plants and converting scrap is always 100% recycled. So there's no more to purchase. There's only a certain amount that you can get.
I'm just
And
saying
that's
it's
all
going to
supposed
push the price up is what I'm saying.
That's a possible distortion. I would agree.
And this is complicated. I mean, I don't know how a paper mill would even get involved in it. I mean, it's so complicated.
Well, what we've seen so far, though, is actually, and again, it's extra cost. There are specialists in EPR in the mill companies.
And so you saw the 20 founding members of Circular Action Alliance. One of them's Georgia Pacific.
Good.
They own mills. But it's on there. However, there, as Susan said, there's now over 1,500 companies that have come on board with Circular Alliance. I don't know how many are paper companies, but they basically don't have much of a choice.
We did push fairly hard on the issue of like grocery store and bail routes, but Oregon isn't budging.
Oregon's pretty prescriptive, more prescriptive than most, although California is probably going to be
Similar. California's going to be
Similar,
similar.
yeah.
And you know, the states that go first, the other states tend to adopt the same thing, so.
Like I said, it's very complicated. I mean, I think plastic and some of the other things are where we really need to focus on. Paper's very high percentage.
Well, you know, on the
recycled.
taxing side of things, paper's going to wind up in much better space than plastics. So, we have another question over here?
good to see you, Darrell.
I'm curious, Bill, if you know in the Oregon plan, I am from Oregon, by the way, and kind of suffered through the plastic bag ban that all sounded good until you put 10 times as much plastic in the bag, and I'm not sure the recycling rates really were affected, and now it's being questioned and looked at. That strikes me as a good question for a life cycle analysis. For example, some evaluation of, does all of this make sense from an environmental impact standpoint? Does Oregon have anything built in to look at, you know, is recycling 100% the answer for all of these complex materials?
So I read the story about the plastic bags in Oregon this past week, and it was quite revealing, and it's an unintended consequence. People had a good goal, but you know, things seem to just happen. You know, I think about LCAs, again, flexibles. Plastic flexibles do really well on LCAs. They're light, they're thin, they're functional, but they're just not easily recyclable. So I don't think EPR takes into account anywhere LCAs, do they?
I read that the state of Oregon, well, we've met some of those people, that they will rely more heavily on LCAs than some of the other states have indicated. Now, I don't know exactly practically what that means, I'm not sure.
LCA's life cycle analysis, and if you don't know what it is,
Yeah.
it's a holistic approach of looking at the environmental impacts of a package or anything. And the issue is, where do you draw the box? But if you draw the box around a candy flexible, and if you put that next to metal or even paper or even glass, the flexible wins all the time in terms of total impact, even considering that it's not easily recyclable. Anybody else?
What happened with the Oregon bags for everybody else?
As long as there's time. I am curious of your thoughts in that, as you pointed out, I don't quite get how the the founding members or the board really is the industry itself. So in a way, it seems like the industry policing itself. How, can you explain how that's supposed to work?
So before we answer that, I'm going to ask you a question. Because most people don't know about the Oregon plastic bag. Can you give us 2 sentences on that so they understand?
Yeah, going back to my,
Yeah, your other question.
yeah, I mean, it's been many, many years that some version of a plastic bag ban, but basically in the sense that single-use plastic bags aren't allowed. So the workaround for that was to build a thicker, again, to me, it's got to be 10 times the amount of plastic just picking it up. So now it's no longer single-use, but it didn't necessarily change behaviors. You were charged 5 cents, and if you forgot your grocery bags like I do every time, I paid 5 cents for the 3 bags, and now I have 30 times more plastic than I would have with my single-use bag. So that's kind of the deal there. It was good, a laudable idea, but as you said, the unintended consequences, more plastic and not that big a change in behavior.
So we'll move on to your other question. That's one of the issues out there is who controls the funding, the purse, and that is the pro. Do they have a conflict of interest? I don't know if it's quite that.
Well, the people who work for the pro are not the same people that work for all the brand owners. So the brand owners are kind of like a board that, it's their responsibility to make things happen. But now I don't know how many people are actually employed by CAA. They have a website, they provide a lot of information. So to that extent, CAA, as an organization, I would think would be responsible, they are responsible to implement the legislation as required in each state. So they would have to have a certain degree of separation from the interests of, Danone, Coca-Cola, ConAgra, Kraft, Heinz.
Yeah, you're looking at the brand owners, and it is the major brands, Coca-Cola, Amazon, all the ones that, are those brand owners.
Well, and the point they made is, hey, we're going to pay the taxes, so therefore we should control how the money is spent. There's some logic to that.
Sure.
Anybody else? Back over here.
If you forget your plastic bag, get a paper bag.
Get your plastic bag in a paper bag.
Florida has a plastic bag ban. I wish they'd implement a ban here. And, essentially people should reuse. I mean, that's the solution to this problem, really. Just, or take plastic bags with you. I mean, if you've got some at home, take them with you. If I penalize myself if I go to the grocery store and I don't have a bag, I put it in the golf cart or the grocery cart, and then I make myself put it in my car. So I just think education is the biggest part of it. I mean, I hate seeing a plastic bag flying down the highway or in the ocean or wherever I go. And
As
I like
part
to
of
fish.
the education,
Yeah.
I
We've become
would-
lazy. It's what we've done. We've become extremely lazy.
But then you have things like an example of one of the complexities and is expanded polystyrene foam. They're not going to meet the 60% recycling goal that California has, and the state said we're going to ban you. And they filed a lawsuit against the state saying, hey, you can't put our package out of business. But states have a responsibility of the environment, and they'll probably win that lawsuit. And you just don't see as much expanded polystyrene around anymore, but it's still out there, and there's a chance it'll go away totally as a packaging material.
well, there are many readily available alternatives to EPS. And the cost isn't that big a deal in the greater, for takeout food, cost isn't the food. What I was going to mention about bags is that I am going to look up the percentage of people who drive to the grocery store, and I would guess that it's a pretty high percentage. So I just put the bags in my trunk, and after you've gone into the store and bought your stuff, oh, I forgot my bag, it's out in the trunk. About 3 times you remember to take your bag in.
So back to polystyrene, and Susan mentioned there are alternatives, but the alternatives, if you did an LCA, the polystyrene always wins. If you take a molded fiber container and a EPS container and do an LCA, the EPS is going to win all the time. But people like, if you tell them, would you rather have this nice feely fiber thing, or would you want, polystyrene? And it's a no-brainer, this decision. It's one of the problems with plastics is the fear of people. They say, would you want something made out of a tree and a fiber, or would you want something made out of polyethylene terephthalate? So we're near the end, and we certainly hope we've imparted some knowledge on something that's it's a train that's coming down the track. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Timing was really good. Yeah. So let's put this back up.
Okay. Good job. Good job, Sue.
I'm always fearful about timing, and I lost 10 minutes. I had an extra 10 minutes in the schedule.
He miscalculated.
Yeah, you could have had more time if you needed.
I
But you worked out great.
Yeah, and that one slide that I forgot. I couldn't get added that.
I'll stand for reception.